The interstellar bazaar of Arcus 9 was a living, breathing maze of chaos. Vendors shouted over each other in a dozen languages, peddling wares that sparkled, steamed, or occasionally wriggled. Crowds of every imaginable species jostled through the narrow alleys, their chatter blending with the clatter of machinery and the hum of distant starships. Jonah weaved through the throng, his canvas jacket hanging loosely off his shoulders and his boots scuffing the metal floor. He had just finished hauling Zarnithian spice barrels for a grumpy merchant and was planning to reward himself with something hot and overpriced from the food stalls. He didn't plan to nearly die. As he rounded a corner near a Gorvath tool merchant's stall, his boot caught on an exposed cable. He stumbled forward, arms flailing, and slammed directly into the sharp corner of a stacked metal crate. A stabbing pain shot up his arm, but Jonah didn't cry out. Instead, he cradled his forearm as he sank to his knees. "Ah, great," he muttered through clenched teeth, pulling his jacket back to assess the damage. His arm was a mess. A gash ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow, deep enough to expose layers of flesh, and blood was gushing from the wound in a steady stream, pooling on the dusty ground. For a second, his heart pounded in panic. Then he shoved the feeling down. "Okay, no big deal. Just stop the bleeding," he told himself, fishing in his jacket for his emergency kit. The kit wasn't much, just some adhesive gauze, disinfectant, and a couple of compression wraps, but it would have to do. He tore open a packet of gauze with his teeth and slapped it over the wound, grimacing as the blood soaked through almost instantly. "Great. That's not working," he muttered, yanking out a roll of compression bandage and wrapping it as tightly as his shaking hands would allow. His vision swam for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. "Jonah. What in the galaxy happened to you?" Jonah glanced up to see Grics, a four-armed Palderan courier he knew from odd jobs. Grics' wide-set, greenish face twisted in horror as he took in the scene. His four hands fluttered nervously, two clutching his head while the others gestured wildly at the blood now staining the ground. "It's nothing," Jonah said through gritted teeth, tightening the bandage. "Just a scratch." "That's not a scratch," Grics shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the blood still trickling down Jonah's arm. "That's your life fluid. You're losing so much of it." "It's fine." "Really?" Jonah said, trying to wave him off. But Grics wasn't fine. His mottled green skin had gone pale, and his eyes were locked on the deep red stain spreading across Jonah's makeshift bandage. His breathing grew shallow, his legs wobbled, and before Jonah could say anything else, Grics let out a strangled squeak and collapsed in a heap. "You've got to be kidding me," Jonah muttered, staring down at the unconscious Palderan. Around him, the commotion was drawing attention. A small crowd of aliens began to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they noticed the blood. Is the human dying? I think the Palderan fainted first. Why is the human so calm? Jonah groaned, cradling his injured arm as he leaned down to shake Grics' shoulder. "Hey buddy, come on, you're embarrassing both of us here." Grics groaned faintly and opened his eyes, his gaze darting to Jonah's arm. "You're still alive." "For now," Jonah said, pulling Grics to his feet. "You want to help me to the medics, or are we just going to keep passing out in turns?" Grics wobbled but managed to steady himself, his forearms grasping Jonah's good arm with a surprising amount of strength. "Medics, now. You're going to bleed out in the middle of the market." "I've got it under control," Jonah said, though the lightheadedness creeping into his vision suggested otherwise. "No, you don't," Grics shrieked, dragging Jonah toward the nearest exit. The sterile white corridors of Arcus 9's medical wing felt worlds away from the chaos of the bazaar. The din of the crowd faded to a dull hum, replaced by the quiet beeping of monitors and the faint whir of medical drones zipping past. Grics all but shoved Jonah into the nearest examination room, his frantic shouting immediately drawing the attention of a medic. The figure floated toward them in Amrithian, its translucent, bioluminescent body glowing faintly blue. "Emergency," Grics yelled, pointing all four arms at Jonah. "The human is hemorrhaging. He's leaking his life fluid everywhere." The medic, whose name tag read Valix, tilted his glowing head toward Jonah, his tendrils twitching as he examined the scene. The human appears to have sustained a severe laceration, Valix said after a moment, his calm tone contrasting sharply with Grics's shrill panic. Significant blood loss. Immediate treatment is required. Told you it wasn't that bad, Jonah mumbled, sliding onto the examination table. Valix pulsed a faint yellow light, a gesture Jonah interpreted as disapproval. It is fortunate you arrived when you did. Left untreated, this wound could have resulted in systemic failure. Jonah's brow furrowed. Systemic failure sounds bad. It is, Valix replied, his tendrils already moving to clean the wound. You have severed multiple blood vessels. Sutures and fluid replacement will be necessary. Grics, still trembling, clutched the wall for support. He's going to be okay, right? With proper care, Valix said, his glow calming to a steady blue. However, it is unusual for a being to remain conscious after such significant blood loss. That's humans for you, Jonah said, his voice light despite the throbbing in his arm. You're horrifying, Grics muttered, sitting down heavily in a nearby chair. As Valix prepared the necessary tools, Jonah leaned back on the table, his head spinning but his grin intact. Relax, Grics, we're just getting started. The bright, sterile light of the medical bay felt more invasive than the needle Valix was threading through Jonah's arm. Jonah lay back on the table, his injured arm stretched out as Valix worked with an unsettling calmness. The Amrithian medic's glowing tendrils moved with machine-like precision, weaving thread through the torn edges of Jonah's skin as though it were an art form. Jonah winced as Valix tightened a stitch. You weren't kidding about the whole multiple blood vessels thing. That's a lot of thread. It is fortunate the laceration did not sever a major artery, Valix replied, his glow shifting slightly toward yellow. Your decision to apply compression likely saved your life. However, your initial delay in seeking treatment was unwise. I had it under control, Jonah said, smirking despite himself. No, you didn't, Grics interjected from his perch on a nearby chair. His skin had regained some of its natural green tone, but his forearms were still clutching at each other like a living tangle of anxiety. You were bleeding everywhere, and you were just sitting there, like it was normal. It's not the first time I've been hurt, Jonah said with a shrug. Humans get banged up a lot. You learn to deal with it. Deal with it, Grics repeated, his voice rising. By sticking yourself back together like a patchwork jacket. It's called stitches, Jonah replied. And I didn't even stitch myself this time. Valix here's got it covered. Valix's tendrils paused briefly as he observed Jonah. Your species' tolerance for injury is remarkable. Pain levels such as these would incapacitate most beings. Yet you continue to engage in casual conversation. Jonah grinned. I've had worse. You said that earlier, Grics muttered, narrowing his eyes. What exactly qualifies as worse for a human? Jonah thought for a moment. Well, one time I fell off a roof and broke 2 ribs. That hurt way more than this. Or the time I burned my hand trying to fix a ship's engine. Or... Stop. Stop, Grics held up all 4 hands, his face twisted in horror. Why do you keep doing this to yourself? Doing what Jonah asked, genuinely confused. Getting hurt, Grics exclaimed. It's like your species goes out of its way to find danger. It's not like we try to get hurt, Jonah said with a laugh. But when it happens, we don't make a big deal out of it. You patch yourself up and keep moving. That's just life. Valix hummed thoughtfully, his glowing form shifting to a curious green. Your biology and psychology are unique among known species. Most sentient beings prioritize self-preservation. Humans, it seems, approach injury with a casual disregard that borders on recklessness. That's one way to put it, Grics muttered, his arms still tightly crossed. Hey, it's not recklessness, Jonah said, his tone light. It's adaptability. Humans don't sit around crying when something bad happens. We figure out a way to fix it and move on. It's just what we do. Valix nodded slightly, his tendrils tightening another stitch, a useful trait in high-risk environments. However, I would advise against relying solely on this adaptability. Proper medical care is essential to long-term survival. Duly noted, Jonah said with a grin. Valex's assistant, the sharp-featured Varakian, handed over a translucent dressing, which Valex applied over the neatly stitched wound. The sutures are complete, Valex announced. The wound is sealed. I will provide you with antiseptic wipes and instructions for care. Jonah sat up, flexing his fingers experimentally. His arms still felt stiff and sore, but the throbbing pain had dulled significantly. You're a miracle worker, Doc. It is my purpose, Valex replied simply. Grics, meanwhile, looked like he was barely holding himself together. Are you sure he's okay? Shouldn't he, I don't know, rest? Be monitored for a week? Maybe a month? His condition is stable, Valex said, his glow shifting to a calming blue. Provided he follows the care instructions, he should recover fully within the standard human healing time frame. See, Jonah said, hopping off the table with a grin. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about, Grics exploded, his arms flailing wildly. You just got stitched together like a rag doll. Jonah chuckled, patting Grics on the back. Relax, buddy. I've been through worse. I don't know how your species survives, Grics muttered, shaking his head. It's a mystery, Jonah said, winking. Now come on, I'm starving. Let's hit the food stalls. As they stepped out of the medical bay and back into the chaos of the bazaar, Jonah couldn't help but feel a twinge of amusement at the curious glances he was already attracting. Word of his injury and the way he'd brushed it off was spreading fast. Jonah, a Zarnithian vendor, called out, her tentacle-like fingers waving him over. Is it true? You nearly died, and you're already walking around like nothing happened. It wasn't that bad, Jonah replied, waving her off. Not that bad, Grics sputtered. It was horrifying. A Varakian merchant nearby perked up, his antennae twitching with interest. The human is resilient, it seems. Perhaps. Indestructible. Jonah laughed. Not indestructible, just stubborn. As they moved deeper into the bazaar, Grics muttered under his breath, still clearly rattled. Jonah clapped him on the back, grinning. Cheer up, Grics. It's just another day in the life of a human. But as the curious stares and murmured conversations followed them, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger misunderstanding. By the time Jonah finished a skewer of spicy shellfish from the Zarnithian food stall, the story of his injury had spread across the entire bazaar. Wherever he walked, whispers followed. Vendors paused mid-sale to point him out, their customers craning their necks for a better look. Is that the human who stitched himself back together? No, the medic stitched him up, but he just let it happen without sedation. Doesn't he have any nerves? Aren't humans supposed to be fragile? Jonah sighed as he took another bite, ignoring the growing attention. Grics, walking beside him, was far less composed. The Paldoran's forearms twitched nervously as he scanned the crowd, his wide-set eyes darting between curious onlookers. This is getting out of hand, Grics muttered, leaning closer to Jonah. Everyone's staring at you like you're some kind of science experiment. Let him stare, Jonah said, shrugging with his good shoulder. I'm not doing anything weird. Not weird, Grics hissed. You almost bled to death, and now you're walking around eating seafood. That's not normal, Jonah. Sure it is. Humans are tougher than we look. That's what worries me, Grics muttered, shivering slightly. The attention reached new heights when Jonah turned a corner near the central fountain and ran straight into a group of Vorian scholars. Draped in flowing robes and holding data pads that hovered beside them on anti-gravity platforms, the three aliens turned their elongated faces toward Jonah with a look of collective awe. It's him, one of them exclaimed, their eye stalks quivering with excitement. Hi, Jonah said, taking a step back. You are the human who suffered severe blood loss yet remained conscious and mobile. Yes, another scholar asked, stepping closer. Jonah raised an eyebrow. I guess so? You're making it sound way more dramatic than it was. It was dramatic, Grics cut in, crossing his arms. He was practically leaking his entire circulatory system onto the floor. The scholars exchanged looks, their antennae twitching in silent agreement. One of them activated their datapad, projecting a holographic image of a human circulatory system into the air. "We have been analyzing human physiology," the lead scholar said, their voice rising with enthusiasm. "Your ability to endure such injuries without immediate systemic collapse is extraordinary." Jonah laughed awkwardly. "I wouldn't call it extraordinary. It's just biology, you know." "Just biology," the second scholar repeated, their eye stalks focusing intently on him. "Your species' ability to adapt to trauma appears to exceed that of any known sentient race. We must investigate further." Jonah took a step back, holding up his hands. Ho-whoa. I'm not signing up to be some kind of lab rat." "Of course not," the lead scholar assured him, though their tone suggested otherwise. "We simply wish to ask a few questions." "Too late," Grics said, grabbing Jonah's sleeve. "We're already late for a delivery. Very important. Goodbye." Grics dragged Jonah away, ignoring the scholar's protests. "You're welcome," Grics muttered once they were out of earshot. "Hey, I could have handled that," Jonah said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "You have no idea what you've started," Grics replied, his voice heavy with dread. "Word spreading. Everyone's talking about you." Jonah snorted. "So what? People get curious. It'll blow over." Grics shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't just curiosity. You've disrupted things. Paldorans, Vorians, Varakians, we all handle injuries differently, carefully. Your species, though, you shrug it off like it's nothing. That's weird. And the galaxy doesn't know what to do with weird." Jonah rolled his eyes but didn't argue. By the time evening fell, the situation had escalated beyond anything Jonah could have predicted. A group of medics from across the station convened in the marketplace, their uniforms gleaming under the dimming lights. Valix led the group, his bioluminescent glow brightening as he spotted Jonah near a food stall. "Jonah," Valix called, his voice calm but insistent. "A word, if you please." Grics groaned. "Oh no, they've brought the whole council." Jonah sighed but turned to face the group, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "All right, what's this about?" Valix drifted closer, his glowing form pulsing faintly. "Your injury and subsequent recovery have sparked significant interest among the station's medical community. We would like to conduct a non-invasive examination to better understand human biology." "Nope," Jonah said immediately, taking a step back. "It is entirely voluntary," Valix assured him. "But the insights gained could greatly benefit interspecies medicine." Jonah looked at Grics, who was frantically shaking his head, then back at Valix. "All right, fine," he said finally, "but no needles." Valix's glow brightened in what might have been approval. "Agreed." The examination took place in a private room within the medical bay, far from the prying eyes of the bazaar. Jonah sat on the edge of an examination table while a team of medics hovered around him, their instruments buzzing softly as they scanned his vitals. Valix observed from a distance, his tendrils glowing faintly. "Your cardiovascular system shows remarkable resilience. Despite significant blood loss, your blood pressure and oxygen levels have stabilized rapidly." "See," Jonah said, grinning. "Told you I'm fine." A Varakian medic adjusted their scanner. "And your pain response?" "Minimal. Your neural activity shows no indication of distress." "Does that mean I'm numb?" Jonah asked, raising an eyebrow. "On the contrary," Valix replied. "Your nervous system appears fully functional. You simply do not react as most beings would." "Yeah, that's just being human," Jonah said casually. The medics exchanged glances, their murmurs blending into a low hum. Valix floated closer, his glow shifting to a contemplative green. "Your species' ability to endure trauma is extraordinary. However, it raises questions about your long-term survival strategies. Do humans routinely sustain such injuries?" Jonah shrugged. "Not routinely, but it happens. And when it does, we deal with it." "Fascinating," Valix murmured. When the scans were complete, Valix handed Jonah a small device. This monitor will allow us to collect data on your recovery over the next few cycles. It is optional, of course. Jonah took the device, studying it for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. Sure, why not? But only if it stops people from following me around. Valix inclined his glowing head. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. As Jonah left the medical bay, Grics trailing nervously behind, he couldn't help but feel like he'd just volunteered for something much bigger than he'd intended. The monitor Valix had given Jonah turned out to be less intrusive than he'd feared. A sleek, palm-sized device that stuck unobtrusively to his jacket sleeve. It silently tracked his vitals and healing progress while transmitting data back to the medics. Valix had promised it wouldn't interfere with Jonah's daily life, but Jonah quickly discovered that the attention it drew was another matter entirely. By the next morning, the story of the unshakable human had spread to every corner of Arcus 9. Jonah couldn't walk 10 steps in the bazaar without being accosted by curious onlookers. Vendors waved him over to ask about the injury, merchants offered him free samples in exchange for stories about human resilience, and scholars hovered nearby, jotting notes whenever Jonah so much as scratched his head. Jonah, my friend, called a Varakian jewel merchant as he passed. Your wound, how does it fare today? Still attached, Jonah replied, flexing his stitched arm for emphasis. The motion drew audible gasps from a pair of Krelth shoppers nearby. Grics was less amused. You're encouraging them, he hissed, clutching Jonah's sleeve with 2 hands while trying to steer him away from the growing crowd. Can't you pretend to be normal for 5 minutes? Normal is boring, Jonah said with a grin. Normal is safe, Grics snapped, glancing over his shoulder at the cluster of gawking aliens. They're treating you like you're some kind of invincible battle droid. Jonah chuckled. I don't think invincible is the right word. Persistent, maybe. The banter was interrupted by the arrival of a Zarnithian researcher. With her gleaming tentacle like appendages and flowing silver robes, she cut an imposing figure. She approached Jonah with an air of authority, her bioluminescent eyes glowing faintly as they scanned him up and down. Human, she said, her voice smooth but commanding. You are Jonah, yes. That's me, Jonah replied, tilting his head. What's up? I am Talix, head of the Arcus 9 Research Consortium, she said, extending one tentacle in greeting. Jonah shook it awkwardly. Your recent injury and your species' response to trauma has become a subject of great interest to our medical and scientific communities. Yeah, I've noticed, Jonah said, side-eyeing the growing crowd of spectators. We would like to invite you to participate in a controlled study, Talix continued, her tone as clinical as it was firm. Non-invasive, of course. We aim to better understand the physiological mechanisms that allow humans to endure such extreme conditions. Grics threw up all 4 of his hands. Here it comes. I knew this was going to happen. Jonah sighed. Look, Talix, I get that you're curious, but I'm not sure I want to be a walking science project. It is entirely voluntary, Talix said, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. However, the knowledge gained could greatly benefit interspecies medicine. Jonah hesitated, glancing at Grics, who was shaking his head furiously. He knew Grics would never approve, but there was something about the offer that intrigued him. If his accident could lead to something useful, even something good, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. All right, Jonah said finally, but only if you promise not to poke me with anything sharp. Talix's glow brightened. Agreed. The research study was set up in one of the station's high-tech labs, far from the chaos of the bazaar. Jonah sat on a padded bench while a team of scientists and medics bustled around him, their movements efficient and precise. The monitor on his sleeve had been upgraded to a more advanced model, its display glowing faintly as it recorded his vitals. Talix stood at the center of the room, her tentacles gesturing as she directed the team. We will begin with a comprehensive scan of the subject's circulatory and nervous system, she announced. Subject, Jonah muttered, smirking. You can just call me Jonah. Understood, Talix replied, though she didn't seem to register the humor. As the scanners hummed to life, Jonah leaned back, his expression casual despite the swarm of activity around him. Grics stood near the door, arms crossed and scowling as he watched the proceedings. I still don't like this, Grics muttered. You don't know what they're going to find. What if they decide humans are too dangerous to keep around? Jonah chuckled. Relax, Grics. Worst case, they find out I've got a heart of gold. That's not how biology works, Grics snapped. Your friend's concern is noted, Talix said without looking up from her datapad. However, I assure you this study is purely observational. The human is in no danger. The scans continued for what felt like hours, with the researchers occasionally murmuring to each other as data filled their screens. Finally, Talix approached Jonah, her glowing eyes studying him intently. Your biology is remarkable, she said after a pause. The speed at which your body compensates for trauma is unlike anything we have observed among other species. Your blood vessels constricted rapidly to reduce blood loss, and your neural responses suppressed pain to ensure functionality. It is a system designed not merely for survival, but for continued action under extreme conditions. Yeah, humans are pretty good at not dying, Jonah said with a grin. Talix tilted her head. It is not merely a matter of survival. Your body's ability to adapt to injury suggests a level of evolutionary pressure unique to your species. Tell me, human, what kind of environment produces such resilience? Jonah thought for a moment, his grin softening. I guess. It's a mix. Earth can be harsh, you know? Natural disasters, predators, the whole deal. But it's more than that. We don't give up even when things get tough. It's in our nature to keep going. Talix's glow flickered thoughtfully. Fascinating. Your species thrives not because of physical strength, but because of adaptability and determination. A truly unique combination. I'll take that as a compliment, Jonah said. As the study concluded, Talix and her team thanked Jonah for his cooperation, promising to share their findings with the wider galactic community. Grics, still visibly frazzled, pulled Jonah aside as they left the lab. You're officially the weirdest human I've ever met, Grics said. Jonah laughed, slapping Grics on the back. Hey, I'm just doing my part for intergalactic relations. As they returned to the bustling bazaar, Jonah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. His injury had started as a mishap, but it had turned into something bigger, a chance to show the galaxy what humans were made of. And if he got a free meal or two out of it, even better.